Everyone always talks about how great exposure therapy is for curing anxiety. The reality is, it doesn't work. At least not until you adopt this one method first. You need to create a cake, but not just any cake, a cake with layers. Normally, when we bake a cake, we start at the bottom, at the biggest layer, but we are going to start at the top. We're going to start small. For years, statistics has shown that one of the top sources of anxiety is the fear of rejection. Approximately 40 million Americans are afraid of rejection, according to the Columbian College of Arts and Science. So we're going to play a little game where I show you the correct way to use exposure therapy, a la the cake method, to overcome rejection. This is you, and you've got a bit of an issue. You're out of work and you need a job by the end of the month. Otherwise, you'll get kicked out of your apartment with nowhere to go. But there's an even bigger problem. You are terrified of job interviews because you've bombed every single one of them you've ever been on. The one you did last week, you blanked on the very first question. The one last month, you confidently answered the wrong question. The one 2 months ago, you tripped, took down a shelf, and shattered a mug. You did not get any of these jobs. And what this has done has created a negative self-fulfilling cycle. Every rejection feeds into the next. You bomb an interview, so you start believing you're bad at them. That belief makes you even more nervous the next time. And because you're more nervous, you mess up again. Each failure cements the idea that you're doomed to fail, locking you in a loop where anxiety builds, performance suffers, and rejection becomes inevitable. It's like quicksand. The harder you struggle, the deeper you sink. The fear of rejection doesn't just sit in your mind. It lives in your body. Your heart pounds before you enter the room, and your hands start to shake when you try to answer. You start dreading interviews before they even happen, making excuses to avoid them altogether. This is the trap of bad exposure therapy. If you keep exposing yourself to rejection without the right strategy, you're just reinforcing failure. And then one day, you come in and you hear about this cake method. Here's how it works. Before you, you see a cake. And as you can see, there are 5 layers. Now the goal of this cake method is to make it to the bottom layer by slowly upping your exposure to the thing that causes your anxiety. In your case, that will be the job interview. So let's start with layer 1. I'm going to call it the sprinkle layer. As you can see, we're putting the sprinkles on the top layer. Sprinkles really fit into this instance because they're these tiny little harmless pops of color that barely change the cake itself. They're there, but they're not overwhelming. You barely notice them, and if one falls off, no big deal. So just like sprinkles on a cake, this layer is all about starting with tiny, low-stakes exposure with rejection. But I actually disagree with the rejection part. I'm going to amend it because I don't think at this stage rejection is what we should be comfortable with. It's easing into being seen and noticed by strangers. When I was growing up, my cousin had extreme social anxiety. I mean, to the point where she couldn't even say hello to strangers. So my grandfather came up with a pretty ingenious strategy. Go ask a stranger for the time. Pretty low stakes, right? But to her, it felt impossible. She froze. So my grandfather upped the ante and he offered her $1 and she did it. Now she was interested, but still too scared. It wasn't until I went with her, standing by her side, that she finally found the courage. She walked up and asked for the time, and nothing bad happened. No one laughed at her, no one scolded her. She survived. This is the sprinkle layer in action. A tiny, almost meaningless interaction, but for her, it was proof that she could do it. All right, so how does this relate to our job interview? Think about it. If my cousin had been forced straight into a full conversation with a stranger, she would have shut down completely. It would have been too much too soon. Job interviews work the same way. If you go straight into a high-pressure, high-stakes interview without getting comfortable being seen, heard, and acknowledged by strangers, your anxiety is already working against you before you even shake hands. That's why the sprinkle method is all about tiny, low-stakes interactions that slowly desensitize you to the feeling of being noticed. For you, this might look like asking a cashier how their day is going, or requesting help at a store, even if you don't really need it. You could comment on a post where someone might reply. None of these things are life-altering. They won't make or break your future, but they do one crucial thing. They teach your brain that interacting with strangers isn't dangerous. And once that starts to sink in, you're ready to level up. Let's talk about our second layer, Introduce layer 2. All right, we've already added the sprinkles, but now we need a little structure, a little smoothness. That's where the buttercream buffer comes in. Now, buttercream is that creamy, velvety layer that covers up the imperfections of a cake. But how does this relate to exposure therapy? Well, just like buttercream, this next step in exposure therapy is about smoothing things out. Not for others, but for yourself. Because here's the thing. Before you can confidently talk to a hiring manager, you have to get comfortable with hearing yourself speak. And for a lot of people, that's uncomfortable. Just go on Reddit. There are hundreds of posts from people who hate the sound of their own voice. They cringe at recordings, and they avoid watching videos of themselves. And the idea of speaking in a job interview, instant anxiety. Why? Because they're not used to it. It's foreign, and what feels foreign automatically feels wrong. I had a friend who refused to listen to their own voicemail greeting because it made them physically uncomfortable. And if you can't even listen to yourself say, hey, leave a message, imagine how harder it's going to be for someone to sit and explain why you deserve a job. And honestly, even I hate watching these videos back. I'll pick everything apart. My voice, my cadence, my tone. Why did I say that word like that? Was that weird? Should I redo it? It's like my brain is hardwired to assume that if I sound even a little off, the whole thing is ruined. So this layer isn't about talking to other people. It's about talking to yourself. For you, this might look like practice answering common interview questions alone in front of a mirror, recording yourself speaking and then playing it back, even if it makes you squirm, reading something out loud just to get used to your own voice. No one else is involved yet. This is just about familiarizing yourself with how you sound so that when it's time to speak to someone else, you don't immediately recoil at your own words. And once you can hear yourself without cringing, you're ready for the next layer of our cake. I'm going to call this one the top tier layer. This is where we really start making meaningful progress in our job interview problem. There's an old Chinese proverb that says, sweat more in peace, bleed less in war. Essentially, what it's trying to say is that the more effort you put into preparation, the less you have to struggle when it actually matters. And when it comes to job interviews, confidence isn't something you just summon out of thin air. It's built through preparation. Think about it. If you walk into an interview with zero idea of what they'll ask, of course you're going to feel anxious. But if you've already practiced answering common questions, researched the company, and prepared stories about your experience, that anxiety starts to lose its grip. Because confidence isn't about hoping you'll do well, it's about knowing you're ready. I'd like to tell you a fable of the archer and the storm, which I think perfectly encapsulates this idea. Once in a small village, there were two archers, Wei and Jin, both known for their incredible skill. One day, the king announced a grand tournament where the winner would earn a place as the royal archer. Wei was naturally gifted. He could hit a target dead center with ease and often bragged that the talent alone would carry him to victory. Why waste time practicing, he scoffed. I've hit every target I've ever aimed at. Jin, on the other hand, was skilled but humble. He knew that talent could fail under pressure, so he trained every day shooting arrows in the morning, practicing in the wind, even training in the dark to sharpen his instincts. The day of the tournament arrived, and the fierce storm rolled in. The wind howled, rain poured, and the target swayed wildly. Wei, who had only ever shot in perfect conditions, hesitated. His hands shook, his confidence evaporated, his arrows missed. Jin, however, remained calm. He trained for this. He shot in the wind, in the rain, in every condition imaginable. With steady hands, he released his arrows, one after another, each hitting their mark. Jin won the tournament, not because he was the most talented, but because he was the most prepared. And that's what I want you to be. Prepared. I want you to know the job you're going after inside and out. When you do, that's when you're ready for our next layer. So this is the mid-tier layer. This is where things really start heating up. You've eased into being noticed. You've gotten comfortable with hearing yourself speak. Now it's time to step into the interview world. You're going to do a mock interview but with a twist. Instead of the one being in the hot seat, you are going to play the interviewer. Now I know what you're thinking. How does this help me get better at job interviews? But here's the thing, most people completely misunderstand what an interviewer is actually looking for. They assume interviewers are out to grill them, catch them slipping up, or make them feel small. But in reality, interviewers are just trying to fill a role with someone competent and easy to work with. By flipping the roles, you get a front row seat to what it actually feels like to be on the other side of the table. Here's why this works. You learn the rhythm of an interview. the back and forth, the pauses, the natural flow of conversation, it all starts to feel more familiar. You start recognizing good versus bad answers, and when you hear someone else ramble, freeze up, or give a great response, you'll start to see the patterns. You'll notice what stands out for better or worse. You'll realize that interviewers aren't scary. When you are the one asking the questions, you'll see that no one expects perfect answers. They just want a conversation. Okay, but how do you do this? First, find a friend, a family member, or even use AI chatbot. If they had a job interview before, even better. Second, ask them real interview questions. Tell me about yourself. What's your biggest strength? How do you handle stress? Take notes on how they answer. Third, pay attention to how it feels to be the interviewer. Are their answers engaging? Do they sound confident? Do they go off on tangents? This insight is gold when it's your turn to be interviewed. Fourth, once you're comfortable, switch roles. Now let them interview you. You'll feel way more at ease knowing exactly what to expect. And only after you've done all these steps, you've been through our little cake gauntlet, should you move on to the final layer, the foundational layer. This one is super simple. Everything that has been leading up to this point. This is where you go and do the actual interview. So let's say that you've gone through our cake layers here. You're probably feeling pretty good about yourself. You're more confident. You step into the room and you do a little bit better this time, but you still don't get the job. What do you do now? Well, you start the process all over from the beginning. You see, that's the dirty little secret of exposure therapy that no one ever mentions to you. One cake isn't enough to fix your anxiety. Some people need 3 trips through the cake, some will need 5, others will need 10. Everyone is different, but that's the key to exposure therapy. It's not about one big breakthrough. It's about consistent, repeated exposure until your brain stops treating the fear like a threat. Each time you go through the cake layers, your anxiety loses just a little bit more of its grip. The first time, you're still shaky. The second time, you recover faster. By the third or fourth time, you're not just surviving the process, you're adapting. Because true confidence isn't built overnight. It's earned through repetition. The more times you expose yourself to the thing that once terrified you, the less power it holds over you. So if you didn't get the job, that's not a failure. That's just another layer of the cake. Of course, there is still something rather important that I haven't talked about. Everyone always talks about how exposure therapy is supposed to go. Start small, gradually work your way up to ending big. What's always bugged me is that people who teach are conveniently leaving out 2 important factors. In fact, I would argue without these 2 factors, exposure therapy probably won't work for you no matter how many cakes you bake. All right, let's take a look at factor 1. Factor 1, rewarding yourself after each victory. Most people think exposure therapy is just about forcing yourself to face your fears over and over until the anxiety magically disappears. But here's the thing. If you don't associate the experience with something positive, your brain will only remember the discomfort. Think of it this way. If every time you go through an interview, all you take away is stress and disappointment, you're just reinforcing the idea that interviews equal suffering. No wonder people quit before they even see results. That's why rewarding yourself after each step is so important. It trains your brain to connect exposure with something good. It doesn't have to be anything big, just something that makes you feel good immediately after a challenge. Nailed a practice question? Treat yourself to a favorite snack. Made it through a mock interview? Watch an episode of your favorite show. Went to an actual interview? Plan something fun afterward, lunch with a friend or like a walk in the park, whatever feels rewarding. The point is to reinforce the progress, not perfection. You're not rewarding yourself for getting the job. You're rewarding yourself for showing up and pushing past the discomfort. And when your brain starts associating exposure with progress and small dose of pleasure, that's when the real change happens. Of course, there is still one more factor I haven't talked about. Factor 2, rate your anxiety level to know when to move to the next cake layer. Of course, there's still one more factor I haven't talked about. I took you through the 5 layers of cake, step by step, but I left out something crucial, knowing when it's actually time to move down to the next layer. Because here's the problem. If you move too fast, you're risking overwhelming yourself. But if you move too slow, you stay stuck. And if you're stuck, exposure therapy stops working. So how do you know when you're ready for the next layer? You rate your anxiety level. Every time you face an exposure challenge, whether it's talking to a stranger, hearing your own voice, or stepping into an interview, take a second to rate your anxiety on a scale from 1 to 10. 7 to 10, you're overwhelmed. Your body is in full panic mode, and you're probably just reinforcing fear rather than overcoming it. Dial it back and keep practicing at this level. 4 to 6, this is the sweet spot. You're uncomfortable, but not paralyzed. You're pushing yourself without shutting down. This is where real progress happens. And 1 through 3, it's too easy. You're not feeling challenged anymore, which means it's time to move down to the next cake layer. The goal is gradual desensitization, exposing yourself to just enough discomfort as you grow, but not so much that you shut down. If you try to skip layers before your anxiety lowers, it's like trying to bake a cake without letting the layers cool. It's going to collapse. And that's the thing. Growth isn't about forcing yourself to withstand the highest level of discomfort. It's about teaching your brain that discomfort isn't a threat. The real power of exposure therapy doesn't come from a white-knuckling your way through overwhelming situations. It comes from consistently showing up, taking on just enough challenges to stretch your limits, and proving to yourself again and again that you can handle it. Because confidence isn't the absence of fear. It's the quiet understanding that fear doesn't control you anymore.